Hello and welcome to The Sensational Life with Bibic. I'm Abby.
And I'm Natalie.
And we are developmental therapists at Bibic.
Each week we're going to dive into the many layers of life with honesty, heart and a little bit of humour, because let's face it, navigating the world with additional needs can be tough, but it also can be empowering, inspiring and yes, a little bit sensational.
Bibic is a national charity that supports many individuals with neurological or developmental challenges, and this podcast is our way of bringing support, tips and real stories straight to you.
This season we're talking all things education, from navigating the classroom with confidence, discovering learning strategies, we're unpacking it all with some great guests too. So whether you're a parent, a teacher or someone that just wants to better understand how to support the SEND community, you're in the right place.
So grab a cuppa, get comfy and let's make the world a little more inclusive, one episode at a time.
Hello, welcome back to the Sensational Life with Bibic podcast. Now, we are back again with Esther and Lauren, and we're talking all things EHCPs. If you haven't listened to our previous episode, please go back because we're talking about the assessment process, where this time we're going to talk about annual reviews. For anyone that hasn't listened to our assessment process podcast, could you guys just quickly introduce yourselves and just let us know who you are and where you're from?
Hi, I'm Esther Salter. I'm a legal director at Irwin Mitchell Solicitors. I specialise in education law. I'm head of education nationally at Irwin Mitchell, and I also look after our public law and human rights team from the Brighton and Gatwick offices. We're spread all over the country, so we've got offices from Brighton all the way up to Newcastle. I do exclusively education law, and really my main focus is on EHCP tribunals, also Equalities Act claims, which will be dealt with under sort of disability discrimination appeals, also in the first tribunal. We'll do judicial review work, challenging government or local government decisions, and anything that's education related in that regard as well. We do complaints with local authorities, with schools, with the local government ombudsman. I am slightly unusual in that I've acted both in-house and also for parents and children, and I also act for schools now as well. So I've seen every which way, and I am mum of a daughter who is ADHD, so I have the personal level of experience too.
And I'm Lauren Haynes. I'm a solicitor in Esther's education team over at Irwin Mitchell. And yeah, I assist with all matters education law related, including advising parents about annual review processes, preparation for them, what happens when they go wrong, and assisting with appeals to the SEND tribunal, if that's necessary.
Very handy for this episode of the podcast, Lauren.
It's almost like I tailored it specifically for it.
It's like we contacted you as a guest on this podcast.
So what exactly is an annual review in the context of this educational healthcare plan?
So an education health and care plan, or EHCP, as we've covered last week, is a legal document. It's supposed to outline all of a child or young person's needs and the support that is required to meet those needs. And these documents can cover children and young people all the way from birth up to the age of 25. So as you can imagine, a child or young person's needs are going to change somewhat over that period, and the amount of support they need might also change. So to make sure that EHCPs stay up to date and can evolve as the child grows, you have annual reviews where at least once a year everyone can come together to review the contents of the EHCP and discuss whether any changes might be needed.
Brilliant. When should, that sounds like a silly question to be honest, but when should the first annual review take place?
Lauren's already mentioned generally they happen annually. Being called annual reviews kind of is a little key. However, that's not always the case, and so slightly loaded really answer. So actually it depends really on the age of the child, so and the circumstances that we're looking at. So for instance, a year in the life of a 20-year-old it's not that long a period of time, whereas a year in the life of a child that's 3 and that has got their first EHCP is quite a long time. And so they're generally the younger children with EHCPs, you often see written into their EHCP that it's going to be reviewed every 6 months. Sometimes it's even every 3 months it might be reviewed. That's probably quite extreme, but it could be really every 6 months that there'll be a review or an annual review of how things are going, just because children develop and change so quickly. You can go from completely non-verbal to verbal, or not walking to walking. So that's the kind of changes you'll see. So yes, generally annually, but can be more than that, as I've said. Equally, there's another process called emergency annual reviews, which I suppose it's the same process, except you have to ask for one. And like it says on the tin, it's normally something has happened, it's an emergency, and that you will ask for a review out of your normal annual review cycle. Otherwise, generally they happen about once a year around the same sort of time, so that everyone knows what they're doing and what they're up to. And I also thought it might be useful to talk about the sort of why or the purpose of an annual review as well, not just when they happen, but also why we're having them, what they're doing. So I think from my perspective, it's very much you've got your first EHCP, for instance, and then let's say it's been in place for a year, and the annual review is the time of reflection. It's time to gather information and assess the information on the child or the young person's progress. It's also about getting input from professionals working with the child or young person. And then it's that time to review and reflect on the special education provision. Is it in place? Is it effective? Is it sufficient? And then we also, because it's an education, health and care plan, we'll be looking at the health and the social care provision as well. Is it still appropriate? Are changes needed? Have circumstances changed? We look very much at the outcomes in the EHCP, the provision, the school placement or college placement, and we consider we also have to consider whether an EHCP is still required. It's also a time to set new targets. Are the current targets still relevant? Have they been met? Do we need new ones? Do we need interim ones? Do we need short-term and longer-term ones? So that's really what we're doing, what the purpose of the annual review is.
And you said it takes into account all of the professionals that are involved with the individual. Is it something that the local authority review each time, or is it something that the school do in-house, or how does it come about?
So responsibility for arranging the annual review meetings technically sits with the local authority, because the local authority is the body that's responsible for maintaining an EHCP. So a lot of these sort of ultimate responsibilities will always sit with the local authority. But generally speaking, what would happen if you've got an EHCP for a child who is attending school, then the day-to-day responsibility for arranging the review meetings gets delegated to the school. So schools will normally get at the beginning of each term like a big list of all the pupils on roll that have EHCPs that are due to be reviewed in that coming term, and the school will deal with the logistics of making sure professionals get invitations, that parents are invited, that if you've got a plan for a child who is able to, that they might be invited to attend. Certainly, if it's a plan for a young person who's age 16 or over, they should be invited to attend the meeting too. And these invites need to go out with at least 2 weeks' notice as well. So schools will deal with that aspect of it. There should be a representative from the local authority's education team attending these meetings. We appreciate that does not always happen, but one of the reasons it is quite important, especially if it's an emergency review where there's obviously something that's not quite working and you do want to consider potentially some significant changes to the EHCP, it is important to have the local authority's representative there, because once you've had that meeting, and we'll talk a bit more about what that meeting looks like and tips to make that as productive as possible, but once the meeting's finished, the school will prepare a report that will go off to the local authority, and in that report they'll set out a summary of the discussions. They'll consider some of the written evidence that's been obtained as part of the review process. So when people get invited to attend, they'll often be asked if they want to provide some kind of written report that can be used to guide conversations in the meeting, and that will be enclosed with this report that the school produces. All of that goes over to the local authority, and the local authority then has to make a decision about whether it's going to make any changes to the EHCP. And if it does make any changes, the local authority's got to issue a new draft EHCP for the parents to consider. So ultimate responsibility for what happens after the annual review will sit with the local authority, but you'll often find schools take the lead on the logistical arrangements of making sure the meeting takes place, and schools will often chair the meeting as well. Often schools will be doing this for several different pupils, so they'll be well versed and well equipped to make sure that all of that logistical stuff gets sorted out.
I think that's certainly for a child that's in school. Obviously, sometimes children or young people are not in school, and they might be on a package of education otherwise than in school. If they don't have a school named in section I of the plan, then that duty to make those arrangements is going to fall onto the local authority. And really, there's such a variety of people you can invite to an annual review. I get invited on a regular basis to annual reviews. But I suppose, frankly, if I'm coming to the annual review, things aren't going well, I would say. And so often that there's been a problem, so recent reviews I've been to, there's been a permanent exclusion of a child with, a fixed term exclusion of a child with SEN, or maybe the child's had a really severe accident at school, or we're in tribunal, or there's something going on. I wouldn't normally go to any annual review. Sometimes parents like to have, someone to come along and support them. They're entitled to bring an advocate or someone to support them at the annual review. I think it's slightly rarer to bring your education solicitor along, but I think when I do go to annual reviews, I try and be as collaborative as possible, and to try and focus the parties on what do we need to achieve, because actually there's some things that you can only deal with at an annual review that's really important for parents to understand. So even if we're in tribunal, and I know we're going to talk about tribunal in a little bit, if we're in tribunal, we can't really talk about the targets when we're in the tribunal arena. They don't have jurisdiction over outcomes and targets, so it's a good time to be reviewing the targets, get those done even if you're in appeal. It's also personal budgets. That's a really good time, that's actually the key time if you're asking for one or if you need to review one. That's the time to go through those. And really anything that you can't deal with through the tribunal process, section A of the EHCP, that's the parents' views, the child or young person's views, their aspirations and wishes. That is the key time to be focusing on that. That is the annual review territory. Again, a tribunal won't look at that. Sometimes I get a nice opponent and they will let us make some little tweaks and amends to that bit, but the tribunal judge and panel won't deal with that. So really important part of the annual review is certainly those bits, but also, we are looking at on your general regular annual reviews, you're looking at the description of the needs and the provision. Is it still relevant?
Yeah. And what should a parent do? Because what about if having the EHCP in place has meant the child is starting to improve and is accessing education more, they're thriving more, and then they come to an annual review and there's the fear that because there's been that progression that potentially they'll want to change the EHCP to sort of tailor now to the child's needs and potentially lose support. What should a parent do in that instance?
Yeah, it's a very valid concern. And we have a lot of parents come to us with exactly that fear of like, oh, well, if we go to this review meeting, are we opening it up to, the local authority walking back on some of this progress we've made and trying to get this support in place? I think the way, as Esther said, these meetings are meant to be collaborative. So it should never be an atmosphere where parents walk into these review meetings and feel like they are being pressured to agree to removing provision that they've had to fight hard for. It should never be a sort of us versus them kind of approach to these meetings. It is meant to be everyone coming together. And the reality is that sometimes where you do have children who have made really brilliant progress, it might be that they do need a slightly different kind of support or level of support than they did when the plan was first drafted. So I would say to parents, be open about considering whether there are changes that are needed, but also really remember that if you've got something, particularly when we're talking about provision, so the support that's in place for this child, that's all set out in section F of the EHCP, if either side, parents or the local authority, want to make changes to that section, they need to have some kind of evidence to back up what changes are needed and why. So what I always sort of try and reassure parents about is if you are worried about going into this review meeting and suddenly the local authority can just turn around and say, well, we don't think one-to-one support, for example, is needed anymore, or well, we don't think they need their speech and language therapy sessions. They're making progress. They've hit some of these targets. It's not necessary anymore. If they don't have any evidence to back up the fact that that support is no longer required to meet the needs, then they're in a very difficult position. So in terms of prep for parents who are worried about potentially going into that scenario, I would say have discussions with the professionals that are working with your child before you go into this meeting, so you can understand from them what changes they are thinking of recommending to the contents of the plan. So if, for example, you might have a child who's got a speech and language therapist who's working with them, and one of your big worries is that the local authority might try and reduce the amount of speech and language therapy support that's set out in the plan, have a chat with the speech and language therapist before you go into that meeting. Ask them to produce a report, a written report that can be used in that meeting, and ask them to be very specific in their comments about what level of support is still required to meet this child's needs. It's kind of almost preemptively gathering evidence to head off any potential arguments from the local authority about reducing provision. Because, yeah, some kids will be making really great progress. And part of the review, as Esther says, is to look at the outcomes and targets and see how this child is progressing against those measures. But just because a child's hit all their targets, that doesn't mean they don't need that support anymore. It might just mean we need to set some new targets and think about what additional progress they might be able to make. So, yeah, have the chats with the professionals early on, and you'll find, it'll be reassuring for you, but also you'll find that you're in a much better position to potentially challenge if those arguments do start coming at you from the local authority.
Well, I also wanted to say that it's vital that targets are regularly updated, and really, there's one of 3 decisions, as we know, that can be made at following an annual review by the local authority. Are they going to maintain the EHCP, leave everything as it is? There's rarely a time when that's going to be 100% appropriate, just to maintain things with no changes. Are they going to amend it? Are there any amendments that need to be made, to one of the sections, A to K, of the EHCP? Or is there, do we need to change placement? What do we need to do? So do we need amendments, or are we going to cease that EHCP? Now, if you don't update targets on a regular basis, if you're not engaging, if you're not having, that input, whether it's professional-led, parent-led, child or young person-led, into the EHCP, because it's a working live document, it moves, kids change, kids develop, then there is a risk that the wrong decisions are going to be made about that young person or child. They're not going to get the right support in school. And if it suddenly looks like they've met all their targets, aren't they brilliant? Well, is that because they've met them and they don't need a plan? Or is that because actually nobody's reviewed it and given them more stretching targets? Do we need further updated assessment of their needs? So it's such an important time, an annual review. And I think actually it's the parents' real opportunity to get engagement, to be looking at everything really carefully. And I think there are things that you can address in annual review that could avoid you problems down the line. So one of the ones that jumps to mind instantly is, well, actually, is the provision in place in the EHCP? If it's not in place, you want to shout about it at that annual review. That's a really good opportunity to say, where's my child's speech and language therapy? Why is it not in place? And you need to be communicating with the school about this. Ideally, you'd have worked that out sooner and had those conversations, chased the school up, realised it's not in place. But if everyone's tried to get it in place, it's still not in place, there's been liaison with the local authority, this is the time for discussing strategy and how to get things done. Lauren, what sort of things would you be suggesting for parents in terms of, kind of key things that you're going to be trying to achieve at an annual review, or they could try and achieve?
Gosh, I mean, yeah, as you say, it's flagging up issues. So if there are problems either with, like you say, the provision, you've secured it in the plan, but it's not actually being delivered in practice, absolutely, now's the time to raise it. It's also, as you were saying earlier, it's a really brilliant opportunity to start thinking ahead and really planning, especially in the lead up to a transition for this child or young person. So if you, for example, have got a child who they're going to be transitioning to secondary school, maybe not next year, but the year after, that annual review before you launch into the transfer process can be really important, because it means you have an opportunity to bring everyone together and have a discussion about, well, actually, is this level of support really sufficient? Is my child going to make the progress that we need them to in order for them to move on successfully to this next phase of education for them? And if they're not, what kind of additional things should we be putting in place now to give them the best prospects of success when that transition rolls around? All too often, we see parents not having any opportunity to have that chat with the teachers, with professionals, with the local authority until you're at the transition review meeting, which should happen just under one academic year before the transition is due to take place. By which point you've got more limited time to try and gather all the information that you need, and it can often make it more stressful trying to pull everything together in time for this September transition. So yeah, I think you're 100% right. So see this as an opportunity to flag any issues that you're facing and really plan ahead, because how often do you get everyone together in one room to have these discussions? Not very often at all.
And I think that leads on quite nicely to like how are decisions made in an annual review, and like what happens if there is a disagreement. So say you're in that transition period and you're disagreeing, what happens then?
So often you won't find decisions being made in the annual review meeting itself. The review meeting is more of a chance for discussion. So if you have people that have differing views, the review should be a chance for everybody to put their side forward and have a collaborative discussion about it. The report of the meeting that's prepared by the school should properly reflect the feedback from everyone that's been there. So if there has been a disagreement, say one professional recommends one thing and school disagree or parents disagree, both sides should be reflected in that review report. So it should be really clear to anybody reading it who's arguing for what. And the decision then gets made afterwards by the local authority. So they will have a period of 4 weeks from the date of the review meeting to decide what it's going to do. And as Esther says, there are 3 decisions effectively that it can make. It'll either keep the plan as it is, it will change the plan, or it will cease to maintain the plan. And if there is a disagreement at that point, so if, for example, the local authority refuses to amend the EHCP when parents have said, no, there are changes that need to be made, or if the local authority says, no, we will change it, but we're going to name X school and parents want Y school, that's where you've got a dispute that ultimately needs to be resolved through an appeal to the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal.
It's probably fair to say, think of your review as we've talked about, it is a review. It's information gathering, information sharing, flagging and raising issues, and shining that spotlight to then getting the school's input and all those professionals, and then presenting it to the local authority for the decision making that comes next. Just before we move on to kind of the decision making and the process and the timetable side of it, because that's really vital and when things go wrong in annual reviews, I just wanted to talk again just a little bit about the emergency reviews, and just to kind of flag some of the some of the times when it might be appropriate to call an emergency review out of the normal timetable. Lauren's already talked about phase transfer reviews when a child's moving from one phase of education to another. We've also got emergency reviews, and those might be appropriate when there's a significant reduction in school attendance, some kind of significant change in circumstances, the child's needs, maybe they've had an accident, is the child a young person in crisis, have they had an autistic burnout, have they had some kind of mental health breakdown, has the school placement broken down? I have been shocked that the emergency reviews have not been called on a client's case of mine that I took over when the school closed down and no review was called by the local authority to sort out changing placement, and that led to significant delay. So any kind of breakdown in placement for a child with an EHCP, that's an emergency annual review. And in the same vein, wanting to request an alternative placement if the child, if the school hasn't closed, if the placement is breaking down, that's your opportunity to say, I want to discuss a different placement. This is not working. They can't meet the needs for my child. That's where you do it. Also, have you had new diagnoses or new expert evidence in for your child? You can call an early review. Emergency sounds very dramatic. We can call it an early review as well. But you can call an early review to highlight those changes, those new diagnoses that really will need to be fed into the provision. Because if you don't, potentially you might have to wait. It could be if you've just had your review, it could be waiting another 11 months until it's inputted. That's not appropriate. I would be suggesting that you call that review sooner rather than later to be getting that provision in place. So I think it's good to know what your options are and when you can be using them.
Yeah. Is there any kind of preparation that families should do ahead of these reviews that you think would be beneficial?
Chat to the professionals, 100%. If you do have treating therapists who are working with your child, definitely ask them to prepare a report so that they can advise on any specific amendments that should be considered for the EHCP. One thing I often say to parents, because asking a treating therapist for a report is one thing. I think to make the reports as helpful as possible, I would always say to parents, be specific about what you want your therapist to advise on. So, updated information about the child's progress and how they're doing and what targets they're meeting, what they're still working on. That's really helpful. But it can also be really important to get specific comments from the therapist. If they look at the EHCP and say, oh, well, actually, that description of need in section B, that's not really relevant anymore. Actually, what we should say is XYZ. Having that specifically set out in the report is incredibly helpful. So chat to your therapist or other professionals, teachers, TAs, whoever. And if you want them to comment on anything specific, obviously don't ever lead a professional to say one thing or another, but ask the question. Say, look, this is what I'm worried about. What are your thoughts? Please, can you make sure that that's included in your report so we can all discuss it at this annual review? I think that's probably the most helpful preparation I advise parents to go through. But also, I think one thing to really make clear, and I know it sounds really obvious, but it's often not, read through the EHCP. Make sure you've got a copy of the most up-to-date version of the EHCP and read through it properly, cover to cover, before your annual review meeting. If there is anything in there that is no longer accurate or that's really out of date, I've seen EHCPs for 20, 21-year-olds who still refer to their needs when they were 7 or 8. That's obviously no longer appropriate. Highlight those and mention them in the review meeting, because that's the prime opportunity to get all of that smaller text updated. And if you haven't read through the EHCP properly, it's really easy to miss those.
And I agree with you, Lauren, about the kind of being prepared and thinking ahead. And I think that makes me think about the fact that, there should be an additional review actually for when a young person is going to year 9 and we talk about preparation for adulthood, and the focus and the tone of the EHCP needs to start to change. It's not how well Tommy or Sally can sit with their legs crossed on the mat anymore, but we're starting to think about those independent skills, employment, really, what can they do that is preparing them for adult life, really. So that's another kind of key time when you want to be preparing for a slightly different review. The other thing you can think about is if your child's getting therapy through the NHS and you get those reports, they're coming in, or you get a hint of that the local authority might be planning to reduce your provision, you may have the opportunity to get your own evidence in. Might not time perfectly, but if you have got a sense, actually, I think they're planning to cut my child's one-to-one, or they're looking to reduce their speech and language therapy, you could seek your own evidence in order to counter that. Equally, I would be talking to the school. I think one of the most difficult situations from an annual review perspective and then subsequent local authority decision making is when parents and schools are not in agreement, or that they've got some kind of relationship breakdown. One of our key tips we give when we talk about this issue is really about parents being open and honest. Don't be hiding things from schools, or not being open and transparent in annual reviews is a very difficult place to be. If you're looking for a specific school, you need to be open and honest about what it is that you're seeking. But also, a really basic thing, remain calm in the review. Don't try and stay as professional and cooperative as possible. If you know that you're going to get emotional, and parents do, because it's tough being a parent.
They're children, isn't it?
It is about the most emotive, issue you're going to come across. Just take someone with you. Get your friend, get your brother, your sister, whoever it is, your partner. Don't go on your own, because actually it's important for you to have that confidence. I love an agenda as well, Lauren. What about you?
We love agendas.
I often get asked for those. So if there's key things, it's hard to remember when you're in the moment and going through. I get annoyed because I find that you can, in an annual review, I find schools sometimes just launch into, let's go through the outcomes, let's go through the needs, let's go through the provision. But actually, I'm there because the child's just been excluded for 2 weeks, and that's what we need to talk about first. So get your agenda in, put the most important issue as item 1 on the agenda. We can go through the EHCP, we need to go through that, but I think there is a sense of picking your battles. What are the most important issues, and making sure your agenda reflects that, and also so that nobody feels underprepared when they're coming into this meeting. And I think if you've got an agenda, that you can try and stick to it as much as possible. If you run out of time, which does happen, you can ask for a further meeting as well. And also, there might need to be time factored in for the young person to join. They might not want to join at the same time as 10 professionals joining the annual review meeting. They might want to have a separate, quieter time to be part of the annual review. Maybe it's just them in the school where you're getting the pupil voice. So adjustments like that can be made. But again, it's just planning ahead, asking what you want, and thinking about what you want. I think those are my key tips.
Love that.
So what are the sort of common pitfalls or things that people often overlook during sort of annual reviews?
I think it touches really nice on what Esther's just mentioned, which is that often if you have key things you need to talk about, but you have a meeting that is led by, for example, a school that has a very regimented process for going through these review meetings of, the form says we've got to look at section A, then we'll look at section B, then we'll look at the outcomes. It can be really hard to actually slot in a time to be like, no, what we really need to talk about is the fact that my child is, kicking and screaming at the idea of going to school. Like, that's a big problem we need to talk about. So I think, as Esther says, getting an agenda together so you know exactly when these things are going to get discussed. It means that's not going to get overlooked, which is great, but it also gives you a bit of reassurance as a parent of, no, there will be a time for us to have this really important part of the chat. It's not going to get brushed to one side. So yeah, I think that's an often common pitfall I find, is that parents will say to me, well, there was something I wanted to bring up in the review meeting, but there just wasn't a good time, or I didn't feel like I had an opportunity to raise something because it wasn't really related to what we were talking about. So an agenda can really help make sure that that's solidified, that you're going to have a chance to bring these things up.
I suppose, sorry.
We haven't talked the whole time, then we talk at the same time.
I suppose it kind of helps with the preparation as well for the parent side of things, if they know what's coming up, what evidence is needs to be raised and things like that.
And I was going to say as well, like, a lot of times with conversations about your child. Especially I've noticed in assessments, like you start on one topic and that then triggers a thought about something similar, but you then lose the fact of what you were actually initially talking about, because it might be you're talking about some sensory difficulties and then that links into food, and then we're off on another sort of tangent about sort of behaviour or something like that. And sometimes I feel like that could be really difficult because an agenda would then pull you back to that original topic basis.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's supposed to be an organic conversation, right? So it will go off in slightly different routes, and you follow the conversation as it goes. But yeah, being able to just go back to the agenda and go, okay, well, that's been really helpful, but shall we get back onto the topic of X, Y, Z? Is really beneficial. But I think it also ties, you mentioned earlier, like evidence of, well, does this help with preparation? I think one of the really common pitfalls I've certainly seen, and Esther, I'm sure it's something you've come across plenty of times as well, is that I've even been in annual review meetings where we're all sitting around agreeing there's a problem, but no one's really sure how to fix it because that expert input hasn't been sought in advance. So we've got everyone sitting around going, well, yes, this child is refusing to go to school, or they're struggling with the sensory environment, but we don't really have any idea of what specifically needs to be put into the plan to address that need. So if you do have a specific problem that you want to tackle in the annual review, think about who as a professional could be really, important to advise on what to actually do to address it, and get that input before the meeting, because you'll find the discussion is so much more productive if you have some kind of expert input.
That's a really good point. No, I think that's a really helpful tip. And actually, I just want to give a really concrete example of something I'm doing on for one of my clients at the moment. The child has got very significant needs. It's a traumatic sort of brain injury client, and so they've really got those profound multisensory sort of needs. And they've got a specialist school named in their plan. They've literally never attended that school. And so with that situation, they've got a school named in the plan. They're getting alternative provision. They're not accessing it through the school. They're barely getting any education. So this is absolutely ripe for dealing with through the annual review process. But what we need to do is show, well, what do they need education wise? So we're getting an education psychologist to assess. We haven't got time to get the report back from the education psychologist between assessment and that review taking place. So we are going to have the assessment from the education psychologist, will read everything, and then they're going to go to the annual review and contribute to the discussions. And what we'll be seeking for that child is a package of education otherwise than in school, also known as EOTIS or EOTAS. But we've got that, assessment from a professional. They're coming along to contribute, and we're starting that conversation. So it is actually seeking a change of placement, but we're doing it in the most productive and informed way we can with the information that we have available at the time. So I think that's quite a concrete example. I did want to mention about when annual reviews go wrong, and I say when they go wrong, obviously they can go wrong in that everyone falls out with each other and nobody, and that can go wrong. It can go wrong in terms of I have had parents not being able to attend reviews and them still happening. That can happen as well. That is not an ideal situation, pretty rare. But what I really mean is, where it tends to go wrong is after the review. And those are the problems that Lauren and I are seeing on a daily basis, and that is, we've talked about breaches of statutory timetables for requesting an EHCP. There is a statutory timetable for having an annual review process. If you look in the Special Education Needs and Disability Regulations, it is set out there. There is this very regimented timetable that should be followed. Lauren mentioned it earlier. You have your review within 2 weeks. The school should be sending the review papers to the local authority. Within 4 weeks of the date of the review, Lauren mentioned they must make that one of those 3 decisions: maintain, amend, or cease. But then I think that it is often a decision doesn't get made, and that's a big problem. If the local authority just sits on the paperwork and you have no decision that is made, once a decision is made, then really is meant to be, if everything's ticked along in the timetable so far, it's then really another 8 weeks to get a final EHCP, amended EHCP out of it if they decide to amend. And so the whole process from start to finish, it shouldn't take more than 12 weeks. Does it ever? Lauren, what's your experience? Do you find it's 12 weeks? I'm not
Oh
sure
my
I do.
gosh.
What's your
Do you
experience?
know what? I've had several families come to me and say, we have now had 3 years worth of annual reviews where no decision was ever made. And we've found ourselves coming back to the review meeting again saying, oh yeah, all those changes we talked about last year, yeah, they still need to be made. And it just never actually goes anywhere. So yeah, I think it is a rare example in my experience that it gets completed in the time frame that it should. But parents need to understand that the law is really clear. It should be completed within that time frame. And if they do find the local authority is, as Esther says, either not responding, not issuing a decision, or being really slow to do so, then there are legal routes they can take to try and address that. We would always say start with a formal complaint, because often that is sufficient to get the process moving, just to get your child's file in front of someone who will action it. But yeah, it can be a really frustrating journey for parents who might have a really productive annual review meeting and come away going, oh brilliant, everyone's in agreement, we want to make these changes, lovely, and then it just doesn't happen because the local authority doesn't action it. So yeah, I think
That's a big
it's
problem,
where it goes
isn't it?
wrong.
Basically. And the reason it's a big problem, we talked in our first episode about EHCPs being legal documents. The provision in section F is the the enforceable provision that your child is legally entitled to. Well, if they've had 3 annual reviews and never a final, then the only thing that you can enforce from a legal perspective is the latest or last final EHCP. Now, if that is 3, 4, I've had 5 years, I've had like ridiculous amounts of annual reviews or EHCPs not being finalised for clients, and it's really shocking when someone comes to you with that position. But it is really problematic if you're trying to enforce the provision in the plan. So I think I completely agree with you, Lauren. Formal complaints are a great way of addressing this. But before you get to formal complaints, our top tips are diarise the deadlines, your 2 weeks, your 4 weeks. And then also the whole 12-week process. If the local authority is going to be amending the EHCP, which is quite a typical kind of decision that they might make if a child's changing, as we've said, then they should send you a draft, just like when you're requesting an assessment, and then you'll have the 15 days to comment, and at that point they'll take in your comments and they should finalise. But that whole process, if it goes beyond 12 weeks, they are in statutory breach. So you can chase it. Do send chasers. Don't ignore it. Don't sit on it. We as parents have a duty to our children to sit up, listen, pay attention, engage with the annual review process, but also focus on the afterwards and know about this timetable. So make sure you can make sure the school has sent the documents. You can send it. You can just check, have the school sent everything to the local authority, yes or no? If they have, then the ball's in the local authority's court. Chase the local authority, get that, make sure you've had the decision, because you can chase them about the decision. Have you had the draft? Have you had the final? And those are all steps along the way that you need to be making sure have happened. If they haven't happened, chase them up. You can do a formal complaint, or you can do a letter before action threatening judicial review for breach of statutory process. One option is free that you can do, and the other option you can pay lawyers like us to do. And they're not, we do statutory breach letter before action for judicial review, but there's normally the child's out of school, or they're not getting any provision in their EHCP. It's rarely the only thing that we would address that way, but it is often part of wider issues going on. So I'm hoping that helps kind of give you a flavour of why annual reviews are important, what can go wrong, and the different kinds of annual reviews that we see routinely. And I think they're an incredibly useful and powerful mechanism for parents with children with SEND.
Definitely. Is this a good point to start talking about sort of tribunals and appeals and things like that. Can you touch a little bit on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually it ties really nicely, because another reason it's so important to get that final decision from the local authority is because if you do need to appeal, so if you know the local authority is going to make a decision, they just haven't confirmed it in writing for you yet, and you're going to need to take it to the tribunal for them to decide what needs to happen next, you can't appeal until you've had that decision. So it's another reason it's so important to make sure you're chasing that, because that is what gives you your right of appeal to the tribunal.
So for the listeners who may be unfamiliar, what is the SEND Tribunal and what kind of decisions can be appealed?
So really, the SEND Tribunal is there to, I would say, to sense check the decisions made by the local authority around education healthcare plans, EHCPs. And so there is, every decision the local authority can make about your child's EHCP can be appealed through the first tier tribunal process. So that could be the decision on whether to assess for an EHCP. If you get a no to assess, it could be whether you get a no to issuing an EHCP after the assessment. You might not be happy with the decision about the contents of the EHCP. Have they described your child's needs properly? Section B. Do you like the provision? Do you agree with the provision that has been specified in the plan? Have they ignored all the private reports and just freewheeled and put anything they like in section F? You can appeal that. So B and F are really common. Probably the most common tribunal that we see in our team is ones involving section I, that is placement or school. And so a B, F and I appeal is probably the most typical one that we will deal with. Also, you can have health and social care as part of the appeals. What is interesting and useful to know is that for education, the first tier tribunal can make orders. There's anything around education, the need, the provision, but also the school. They can often make orders around that, depending on the type of school. With health and social care, they can't make orders, they can make recommendations. So they can make recommendations to the ICB or to social care in terms of things, it might be the description of needs or the provision. More often than not, those are followed, but it is not quite as good, not as an order by the tribunal. So those are the kind of appeals. So you can ask for a reassessment of the EHCP, which they can say no to, and if they say no to that, you can appeal that as well. So pretty much everything you can appeal to do with an EHCP. If I've forgotten any, Lauren, if I missed any out, I think
the only one to jump on is also decisions to cease to maintain EHCP. So if the local authority decides that it's going to stop maintaining the plan completely, you can appeal that decision to the tribunal as well. And the thing is, like, the orders you can get from the tribunal, as Esther says, health and social care is slightly different because it will only make recommendations. But for taking for example an appeal against the contents of sections B, F and I of an EHCP. So parents disagree with what's been described about the child's needs, about the support they should get, and they don't agree with the school placement that's been named. If you go to the tribunal can make a very specific order requiring the local authority to issue an EHCP, like a new final EHCP for the child in specific terms. So it will, for example, use the exact wording that this new final plan must include, and the local authority legally has to issue a plan in line with that decision. So the tribunal is a really helpful mechanism to seek very specific directions and orders requiring local authorities to take specific actions.
And do parents need legal representation to go through the tribunal process?
No, they don't. They don't. So then it's meant to be, or it's intended for these appeals, that parents should be able to bring them themselves, and that they are not as formal as going into kind of a civil claim or the criminal court. It's quite a different arena. It's more relaxed in terms of it's online now. They're all online unless you specifically ask for one in person. So you get kind of like a video link to join the kind of the court's video link service, and so you will join that way, and then adjustments adjustments are made for parents really so that they can cooperate at their level. And so yes, there are tribunal rules and guidelines that we're supposed to follow in terms of making applications and how to run the claim, but actually a lot of those formalities can be relaxed to help parents engage when they're not legally qualified or at their level. A lot of parents have advocates or solicitors like us, or some kind of support or supporter that they can take along. So there is a real variety available. But you also have to be quite careful about that, because if you are paying someone to represent you at tribunal and their only experience is that they've been to tribunal once for their son Bobby, you may not want to be paying them a lot of money. And that I would say the advocates are not regulated, and so unlike solicitors and barristers who are very carefully regulated, we do hearings ourselves and our own advocacy as solicitors, as well as preparing the tribunals. Sometimes if it's a really complex case, we might instruct barristers to do the final hearings. We tend to see the inherently more complex cases, don't we, Lauren? So I would say, no, you don't need a solicitor, or you're not meant to need a solicitor, but they can be really complicated. But more than that, I think we've talked about your children, emotional issues, having to talk about your child. I've been in tribunal recently for my own child, trying to deal with my own child's son, and I say, Lauren, can I just sense check this with you, because I need to take my mum hat off, and it's really hard to do that. So I've had many lawyer clients who really thought they could do it all, and they struggle because it's their child. So it's so no, you don't need a lawyer, but obviously we're great and we're really supportive and helpful, and we can. And I think what I do find is that the parents I work with, that sometimes it's just that headspace that you don't have to give to another thing, because you've got your child with SEN, maybe they're out of school, maybe you've got other children, and the mental load is immense to have to then do your own tribunal appeal. We might do the whole appeal for a client, but also we might just do a little bit of advice along the way. So if they tell parents or our clients how to do stuff like, this is the form you need, just lodge this, we might just do the final hearing for them, or they'll just come along for tips along the way. There is such a variety that you can, in terms of how much support you may or may not want, and it varies depending on the type of appeal as well.
Totally. And I think, as Esther said, so it's supposed to be an accessible process, and the tribunal panel, who will be making the decision, headed by the tribunal judge, they're going to be understanding that if a parent is doing this on their own, that they're not going to necessarily understand the ins and outs of all the legal procedure. But fundamentally, it is a legal process, and there are lots of legal tests and bits of case law and all the rest of it that, especially in very complex appeals, it can put parents at a real disadvantage if they have no understanding of that at all. So seeking, even if it's just a bit of strategy guidance, can be really valuable. But I think it's also really important for parents to understand that if they are eligible, they can find that they might be able to receive some kind of legal aid funding to cover the costs of having solicitors assist them with this process. It's obviously subject to means tested criteria, so it can be quite limited in terms of who's going to be eligible for this, but it is an option that's out there for parents that so many parents just don't know exists.
Yeah, thank you guys. For our listeners that might be wanting to contact someone, how would they get hold of you guys if they needed some support with the tribunals or EHCP process?
I think I would say visit our website. So if you visit our website, there's an option to put in a new inquiry, or you can telephone in. We've got like a legal call centre which takes our new inquiries, so you can contact us that way. Obviously, you can ask for Lauren and I. We may or may not have capacity to assist. But as I said, we've got offices all over the country. We've got quite a strong team of education lawyers and paralegals who would be happy to assist. And also, I can't recommend highly enough some of the charities out there, local SENDIAS services. volunteers are amazing. And IPSI, SOS SEN, or SOSN as they get known as. And there's a great document which we always mention and flag to parents called the Noddy Guide. And the Noddy Guide has got all the case law, it's got all the legal tests, it's brilliant. So it's a really useful resource. And I think what we haven't talked about is mediation, and sometimes mediation can be a really useful tool of avoiding tribunal. And as can, I like to do a letter of persuasion, setting out the legal test if I think it's been applied incorrectly. So we do go to tribunal when we have to, but if we can do mediation and that can resolve the issues, you can't mediate on placement, but refusal to assess, refusal to issue can be really great to do mediation for those. It can avoid a lengthy tribunal. So I would say, think about alternative remedies, and if you do want some advice and you want to know, then obviously we can help, and we can look at what's the best options for you.
Brilliant. All right, well, thank you so much for your insight into those. I know I have definitely learned a lot, and I will be taking it to my assessments and sharing what I've learned with you guys. So I do hope it's been helpful for our listeners as well. But we really appreciate you guys coming on, and well, I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon at some point.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in to The Sensational Life with Bibic. We hope you're leaving with new insights, fresh ideas, and a bit more inspiration than when you press play.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow or subscribe. And if you have a moment, leave us a review. It really helps us reach more listeners and grow this amazing community.
If you've got a question, a story to share, or a topic you'd love us to cover, we'd love to hear from you. Email us at thesensationallife@bibic.org.uk.
And don't forget to come over and say hello on social media. Follow Bibic to stay up to date with episodes, extras, and maybe some behind the scenes bits.
Until next time, keep it sensational.